Hello everybody, welcome to my channel, Ivan's Woodworking 101, or Woodworking 101 by me, Ivan. I'm just gonna do another little short video today, talking about sandpaper and the different types, the different grits, and what all that means. What exactly is the best sandpaper for your project? Um, Now, there are millions of different types of sandpaper: garnet, silicone dry lube, wet and dry, aluminum oxide, and then there's tons of different types of sanding sponges and sanding pads and steel wools. But for the beginner, the best thing to do is to keep it simple and realize that for your projects, there's three different main types of sandpaper that you want to focus on, and I'll show you those right now. These here in our little display kind of show you all the papers that you really need. Now, you start off with the bare wood paper, which is all this stuff here. It's called garnet, and the reason for that is they use a special type of stone rock, and they hammer it, and it's all literally glued on to this super thick backing. So that's a pretty thick piece of paper. Like you can kind of see it there. It's pretty thick. So they use this to sand bare wood. It's called garnet, and on the back you always see the 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 name garnet there, and then the grit, 60 grit. Now with sandpaper, the lower the grit, in other words, we got 40 grit, I believe, right here, 50 grit, sorry, 50 grit here, and then 60 and all the way down. So the lower the number, the coarser the grit. You can see how coarse that is. We go down to, let's say, a 220 grit right here. You can see right there, 220 grit. Look how fine that is. That's really fine sandpaper. That is for basically sanding your wood as smooth as you possibly want to go. When you get to the 40s and 60s, a lot of guys will use this stuff for stripping wood, or they'll use it when they're sanding a very rough, coarse piece of wood. They need to kind of really sand out that really coarse roughness, and then they start working their way down the grits to where they want it to be, where they want the wood to be. So on the side we've got written down the different grits. You can kind of see it: 80, 100, 120, all the way down. So the higher the grit, the smoother the finish. And this is all for bare wood. So garnet sandpaper, bare wood. The finer it is, the higher number you're going to see on the back of the paper. Now, you would never use this for sanding a finished product, because you're going to scratch it, you're going to mark it up, it's going to look horrible. So all this here is just for bare wood. Now, for finish, you want to use this stuff. This is called silicone dry lube, and it's really fine. Even the coarse stuff is pretty fine stuff. Like we have 100 grit here, and it's very fine. It's still coarse, but it's much finer than the garnet paper. And this stuff is used primarily for sanding between coats of lacquer, polyurethane, varnish, that kind of thing. You might sand it for oil finishes, but not really, because what it has is it's impregnated with silicone. And what silicone does is it acts as a lubricant. So when you're sanding, you're not scarring or marring the finish. All you're doing is scuffing it. So that's why we have all these different fine grits. 220, I think 400 is the highest we carry. You can go finer, but it's not really necessary. Again, lower the number, 100 grit, the coarser the paper. The higher the number, the finer the paper. So this is primarily for sanding between coats of clear coat, varnish, lacquer, polyurethane, so on and so forth. Most times you want to stick between, say, 320 to 400, like down in here somewhere. 320 grit, you can see it there, and that's a good grit, and it's just to break the surface a slight bit, so that when you're sanding, you can have both coats binding to each other really well. If you don't sand, sometimes you'll get the second coat pulling away from the first one. So you want to sand it a little bit so that you get a little roughness there, and then when you brush on the second coat or spray on the second coat, it binds really well, and you're not going to have any peeling later on. So usually 320 to 400, 280 might be okay too, but anything lower than that you're going to start getting marks. Now, why do they make coarser paper then? Well, some people will use the rougher grits like this for different types of finishes. Like I said, there's tons and tons of different kinds of clear coats. So the coarser grits usually they'll use to sand out something, and then if they're doing like an exterior finish somewhere and they're doing an oil finish, they want to really rough it up, and so that when the new coat goes on, it really soaks into the wood really well. But this kind of paper you would never use for sanding bare wood because of the silicone. If you get silicone on the bare wood and you start varnishing it or doing anything to it, you're going to get all sorts of issues with bonding, and you could very easily see your finish start to orange peel. It'll look like a surface of an orange, or you'll start to see it start to pull away, or you'll start to see it react there's a dozen different ways, but you'll know as soon as you see it. So you want to avoid using this kind of stuff for sanding bare wood. Primarily it's just for clear coats. It's called silicone dry loop. And of course there's different types. So you have this redback paper. The same idea as this stuff, it's just a more premier grade. And they make these up to 1,000 grit. If you come over here, you'll see all this stuff here. And it's a premier red paper. Sometimes it comes in a blue color. Oops, I'll pick that up later. But you can see it here. It's all redback paper, and it is a much finer grade. They go right up to 1,000, 1,500 grit, and it really is for really fine finishing. Or if you're doing a lot of people that are in the business of doing touch up and repair, they'll use this stuff, or finishers that want to spend the extra money, then they will go for this kind of paper. It's probably about, I would say, 50 to 75 cents up to $1 a sheet more than this stuff over here, but it does last longer and it gives you a better finish. The Premier Red, it's called. Then you get into another kind of paper. This is wet and dry paper. All this stuff, it's black in color. Sometimes it's kind of a light gray. Sometimes it's a bit of a bluish tone like this, but it's called wet and dry. And they call it wet and dry because you can use it to sand wet or dry, meaning if you're doing, say, an oil finish, or you're going to use it to buff out something, you're going to be using polishing compounds, or sometimes I'll use mineral spirits. and then they wet it and with the sandpaper, and that gives a lubrication, and it gives you a much finer finish, and it allows the, say you're using oil, it'll push the oil right into the wood, so that it gives you a much smoother, finer finish, and it conditions the wood. And this stuff goes very coarse, 60 grit again. You can see it's very, very coarse, and right down to very, very fine, which is 2500 grit. You can see it there, and that is extremely smooth paper, very, very smooth. Like you can see the smoothness. And then you have different grades in between, 600, 1200. So that paper used if you're doing oil finishes, if you're doing polishing, if you're working on an exterior project, or if you're using tung oils, Danish oils, teak oils. Usually it's a good idea to use this kind of stuff. You might brush on a first coat of, let's say, a teak oil, and then you'll use about a 600 grit, which is right down here, I think. This stuff here, yeah, 600 grit. And this is used, this is a great paper for oil sanding, for wet sanding oils. You'd wet sand it a little bit, then you take a rag and wipe off the excess, and then you do a second coat, brushed on or wiped on and wiped right off. But the first coat you wet sand with this going with the grain, and it gives you a really smooth, fine finish, keeps the wood conditioned, keeps it from drying out, and it makes it easier later on to do a touch-up, or just to do another coat of clear coat or oil or whatever you want to do. And this is used wet and dry. So this kind of paper I was going to mention before is kind of similar to this garnet paper, which is meant for wood. Some people will use this stuff for sanding bare wood too. There's no silicone in it, so it's good. It's almost got like a tar kind of feel to it, but it's a black stone they use. And it's exactly the kind of paper you need. Okay, sorry about that. Got interrupted there by my nephew. But you can see, anyways, those are all the different kinds of papers there. And there. The basics. So that is kind of a very basic, brief introduction to sandpaper. Again, for the beginner, that's pretty much all the sandpaper you would need. You don't really need to get any more complicated than that. Again, there's sanding sponges, there's steel wool, and things like that. But for what you might be working on, that kind of sandpaper is pretty much enough. There's different types. Like I said, there's sanding sponges like these, foam back. You can see here. But that's pretty much it. Sanding pads here, see, which are, they're more flexible for sanding curves and angles. But that's basically it. So you don't need to get much more complicated than that. But if you want, you can. But that's pretty much the basics of sandpaper. That's it. There's not much more to it than that. So keep that in mind, remember. And if there's any questions, you can comment or just leave a question and I'll answer it. But yeah, that's all the basics of sandpaper for your finishing projects at home. So if you have any questions, again, comment, or you can directly email me. I'll answer the questions as they come. But good luck with your finishing, and um, remember, the higher the number, the smoother paper, the coarser the grit, the lower the number you're gonna see. So, and remember, garnet, silicone dry lube, wet and dry. Those are the three basic types of paper you wanna use. You don't need anything more than that. So yeah, I hope you found this video informative and learned something. And until next time, good luck with that home project, the DIY project of yours, and you will see me again. I'll be posting more stuff, and we'll do a deeper dive maybe next time into some of the other different types of papers. Now, if there's videos about certain things you want to see, again, DM or leave a comment and talk about what you would like me to talk about, show you. Um, our store has a little bit of everything in it, so there's nothing I can't show you. So, yeah, good luck, and I'm Ivan signing off. This is Woodworking 101 by Ivan. Till next time, bye bye.